By now, you've all heard a lot about fitness celebrity trainer Jillian Michaels going on to CNN's Abby Phillips show and saying this about slavery. Check it out.
Some of those things that are in there? Because have you looked at some of the things that are being reviewed?
Slavery was a bad thing that was to talk about.
Okay.
Like,
he's not whitewashing slavery.
So he's not?
He's not. No,
okay.
He's not. And you cannot tie imperialism and racism and slavery to just one race, which is pretty much what every single exhibit does. But let's talk about the fact that when you
can't tie slavery.
Let's talk about the fact.
Slavery in America was.
Do you realize that only less than 2% of white Americans owned slaves?
But it was a system of white supremacy.
You realize that slavery is thousands of years old?
White people were
Do you know
the slave
who
owners.
was the first race to try to end slavery?
Wait a second.
Well, what's controversial?
I'm very surprised.
So basically, you heard her say that all was less than 2% of, white people here in America that own slaves, and slavery is thousands of years old. Now, they, being the other guests, were kind of astonished, right? Like, what? Because she was basically downplaying slavery, and she said that Trump is not whitewashing slavery. Well, I think that it should be given just a little bit more of context as to what slavery was and who was enslaved and how many people actually owned slaves. So during the height of slavery in the United States, approximately 89% of Black people were enslaved. This means that the vast majority of Black American population in the U.S. was living under the brutal system of slavery. For example, in 1860, there were roughly 4.4 million Black people in the U.S., with about 4 million of them being enslaved. Now, again, this is coming from the years of 1790 through 1860. Again, we are talking about chattel slavery, which means that the slaves are people, right? Were not humans. They were considered to be property. Now, when focusing on individuals legally recorded as slave owners, the percentage is lower compared to considering all members of households that benefited from slavery. So that just basically means that, yes, while the percentage of slave owners were low, you have to consider the amount of people that were in that household. So maybe it was a household full of 10 people. They all benefited from having slaves. All right. Carrying on. So clearly there were more slave owners in the South than there were anywhere in the United States. Now, one study suggests that in 1860, approximately 20 to 25% of families in slaveholding states owned slaves. That sounds like more than 2%, doesn't it? Carrying on. While other sources indicate the percentage could be as high as 49% in states like Mississippi and South Carolina. Other sources state that roughly 25% of white American households in the South owned slaves. While a significant portion of Southern families owned slaves, the majority owned fewer than 5. And the bulk of the wealth and political power generated by slavery was concentrated in the hands of a small number of large-scale planters. So planters obviously being plantations, right? Okay. Now, even white Americans who did not own slaves benefited from the institution through industries that supported slavery, such as shipping, or by providing goods and services to slave owners. Additionally, the existence of slave class at the bottom of the social structure provided a degree of social elevation for even the poorest whites. So, for example, if those whites owned some wood, they might have sold that wood or whatever it was they used on slave ships, probably wood back then. They sold the wood to build the slave ships. So maybe they didn't have slaves, but they sure did provide the materials for those slave ships to go sailing and bringing back slaves to, do the dirty work, right? All right, moving right along. Now, in conclusion, while the exact percentage of white individuals who owned enslaved people is difficult to pinpoint, historical data indicates that a notable portion of white families, particularly in the southern states, directly participated in and benefited from the institution of slavery. However, it is also important to acknowledge the broad economic and social impact of slavery that extended beyond direct ownership, influencing the lives of all Americans during that period. Now, what we're going to do, we're going to see the difference between how slaves in America was treated and how slaves throughout the other parts of the world were treated, because you heard Jillian say, oh, slavery is thousands of years old, right? Alluding to that, well, it's not just American white people that had slaves, right? So let's continue. Now, obviously, there were different types of slavery, primarily based on race here in America, with enslaved individuals predominantly of African descent. This racial distinction was used to justify the enslavement of a specific group of people, unlike many other historical forms where slavery was based on factors like war and debt. Now, the other forms of slavery, while some other forms of slavery also involved race, like the Arab slave trade, the American system exclusively focused on race, okay? Now, permanent and inherent bondage, because there's a difference, right? American slavery was a lifelong condition, and children born to enslaved women were also automatically enslaved, resulting in a hereditary system. This meant slavery was not a temporary condition or a pathway to freedom, but a permanent state based down through generations. So basically, again, if a woman had a baby in American slavery, well, guess what? That baby was a slave too, and so on and so forth. Now, in other places in the world, including some forms of slavery in Africa, slaves could earn their freedom or their children might be born free. Now, let's talk about the economic system. American slavery was closely tied to the capitalistic economy, particularly the plantation system. Enslaved people were viewed as a source of labor and profit, driving the economic growth of the southern states and contributing to global markets. Now, in other forms of slavery, while slavery was often a part of the economy in other places, American slavery scale and integration into a global economic system are distinctive. So basically, it's saying that it wasn't just America that benefited from slavery here in America. All other parts of the world did too, okay? Because you had banks and different things that funded the slave trade, the missions through the transatlantic slave trade and all that, right? Now, in conclusion, it should be said that the justification of American slavery as the nation was founded on ideas of liberty and equality. This justification often involved a racist ideology that portrayed enslaved people as inherently inferior and suited for servitude. Now, in other parts of the world, slavery was simply a consequence of conquest or other circumstances without the need for the elaborate justification. So I say all of that to say, while Jillian Michaels is sitting up there talking about, oh, it was just 2% and other people had slaves as well, there was a difference as to how Black people in America during slavery was treated. Of course, we don't have to talk about all the other inhumane things that happened because we know about it, but maybe she doesn't. Maybe she doesn't realize that slaves were often sexually abused. They were split up, right? The children were snatched from families, and husbands and wives and things like that were sold off and never to be heard of again. Of course, forced to work from sun up to sundown, picking 300 pounds of cotton a day. And if that was not done, they were often whipped and beaten to a bloody pulp. But see, she likes to sit up on platforms apparently and downplay what slavery really was. And so she's talking about Trump wasn't whitewashing slavery. Well, it sounds like she was whitewashing it to me. So anyway, y'all let me know what you think of that. And for more insightful commentary, please subscribe to this channel.